The first time Ida Varn heard it, she thought it was her daughter. This was not impossible. Her daughter lived 4 miles south and visited on Sundays and occasionally on other days when the road was passable and the children were manageable, and she had some reason to come. The voice outside the window had a quality that arrived in Ida's ear and moved immediately toward recognition. The particular pitch and cadence of a woman she had known since before the woman could speak. The specific music of a voice that had been part of her listening for 43 years. She set down her mending and went to the window. The yard was empty. The snow lay across it in the flat, unbroken way of snow that had not been walked on since it fell 2 days before. A white surface that held no tracks, no mark, no evidence of any passage. The gate at the far end of the yard was closed. The road beyond it was empty in both directions as far as the tree line. Nothing. She stood at the window for a moment looking at the snow. Then she heard it again, or not heard it exactly. The word heard implied a clarity, a locatability, a sound that arrived at the ear from a specific direction and announced itself as sound. This was different. This was sound at the very threshold of perception, the place where the mind begins to construct meaning from sensation, and the sensation is not quite sufficient to support the construction. Like hearing your name called from a distance and not being certain when you turn, whether you heard it or only thought you heard it, whether the mind made the meaning from less than it needed, or whether the meaning was truly there. She stood at the window and listened, and could not make out the words. This was the thing that would stay with her, in the weeks that followed and in the years after that. Not the presence of the voices, which she came to understand as a kind of fact about that winter in that place, but the specific quality of them, the way they sat at the edge of comprehension and refused to cross over. The way they had the shape of language without the substance of it, the way a word looks familiar in a foreign tongue. You recognize the architecture of meaning without being able to enter it. She stood at the window for a long time after it faded, long enough for the cold of the glass to move through the air around her and find her hands and her face, long enough for the light outside to shift perceptibly toward evening, long enough to be certain that what she had heard was not the house settling, not the distant sound of a neighbor, not any of the ordinary explanations that presented themselves first because they were comfortable and because the mind preferred comfort before accuracy. It was not any of those things. She had been in this house for 31 years, and she knew its sounds the way she knew the sounds of her own breathing, completely, without effort, the knowledge built into her before she was aware of acquiring it. She knew the creak of the second step on the porch stairs. She knew the sound the kitchen door made when the wind came from the northeast and pressed it slightly off its frame. She knew the way her husband moved through the house in the night when he could not sleep, the particular heaviness of his step that had lightened over the years in the way of an old man's step, the creak of the third floorboard in the hall. She knew the creak of the east wall in northwest wind. She knew the sound the chimney made when the draft was strong and the sound it made when the draft was poor. She knew the way the yard sounded in different temperatures, the quality of stillness that very cold produced, that was different from the stillness of milder cold, a density to the air that changed the character of every sound that moved through it. She knew all of this, and what she had heard was none of it. She went to find her husband. The place itself deserves a moment before the people in it. Sallow Creek was named for the creek that ran through the valley floor, a watercourse that in summer ran clear and modest over limestone bedrock, and in winter froze from the edges inward in the particular way of limestone-bedded creeks, developing a shelf ice that was darker than ordinary ice, almost amber in certain lights, the color of the stone it grew from. The valley was neither wide nor deep, but it had the quality of enclosure that Ozark hollows often had, the ridges on either side close enough to create a sense of being held, of the sky being a narrower thing than it was in open country. In summer, this made the valley cool and pleasant. In winter, it made the cold settle and concentrate, the way cold settled in bowls and low places, and winter in Sallow Creek was consistently harder and longer than the winter in the open country 2 ridges east. This was known and accepted by the people who lived there. They had chosen the valley for its bottomland and its water and its timber, and they had accepted the harder winters as part of the bargain the land offered. 31 families by 1876 had made that bargain and found it acceptable. What they had not anticipated when they came was what the harder winters did. Elias Varn was 67 years old in the winter of 1876, and he had lived in the Sallow Creek settlement for 31 years, which made him the longest tenured resident of any community in that part of the Missouri Ozark country. He had come in 1845 with his wife and a wagon load of tools and intentions, and he had built on the land and buried 1 child in it, and raised 3 others, and had watched the community grow up around him from 6 families to 31. And he knew the place the way a man knows a thing he has invested a life in. Not with the detachment of observation, but with the investment of it. The specific knowing that comes from putting your hands into something for decades and feeling it change beneath them. He was in the barn when Ida came to him. He was doing what he always did in the late afternoons of hard winter, tending the animals with the slow, unhurried thoroughness of a man who understood that the animals' welfare was the farm's welfare, and the farm's welfare was his own, all one continuous thing. He looked up when she came in and read her face the way he had been reading it for 45 years of marriage, which was to say instantly and completely. He said, "What is it?" She said, "Come outside and listen." He set down the feed and came outside, and they stood together in the yard in the late afternoon cold, Ida pointing in the general direction of the north field and the timber beyond it, and Elias listening. He listened for a long time. He said, "I hear it." She said, "What does it sound like to you?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Voices, more than one." He paused. "I can't make out the words." She said, "No, neither can I." He said, "How long?" She said, 10 minutes, maybe, since I was at the window." He looked at the north field, at the timber line beyond it, where the hardwoods stood stripped of leaves in the winter light. Nothing moved. The snow between the barn and the timber was unbroken. The air was still, the kind of stillness that came in the deepest cold, when even the wind had gone somewhere else. He said, "It's not coming from the timber." She said, "No, it's not coming from anywhere specific. It's coming from the air." He looked at the sky. Pale gray, the flat, undifferentiated gray of an overcast winter afternoon. The light was already failing at the edges. He said, "We should go inside," she said. "You recognize it, don't you?" He looked at her. She said, "I saw your face when you heard it. You recognized something." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Come inside. I'll tell you what I think." They sat at the kitchen table, which was where they had sat for the serious conversations of their life together. Not the everyday talk, which happened anywhere, but the things that required the specific gravity of sitting down across from each other, with the table between them and the fire at their backs. Ida had made tea. They held their cups, and Elias looked at the table for a moment before he began. He said, "You remember the winter of 51? She said, "I remember it." He said, "Before the fever. That January, when it was very cold and we had the 2 weeks of snow that didn't break. She said, "Yes," he said. "Do you remember the night the Calder boy went missing? The oldest one, Henry. He was 10, she said. I remember. He was found in the morning, in the Petrie barn, sleeping. He said, that's right. He said he had followed voices. He said he had heard voices in the snow and had followed them to the barn and had gone inside because the voices seemed to be inside, and when he got inside, there was nothing there, and he had gone to sleep in the hay." Ida was still. He said, "I didn't think much about it at the time. A boy, a cold night, probably a dream or a child's interpretation of wind. But I asked him about it later, the following spring, just out of curiosity. He was 11 by then and clear-headed. I asked him what the voices had sounded like. He looked at Ida. He said they sounded like someone talking in the next room. Words he almost knew but couldn't quite make out. He said it was like standing outside a door, listening to a conversation happening on the other side." Ida set down her cup. He said, "And then in the winter of '63, the hard winter, the one that killed the Mercer cattle." She said, "Yes," he said. "You remember talking to Paulette Greer about it. After." Ida was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. She said she had heard her mother. In the snow, outside the window. Her mother had been dead for 6 years, he said, and she said she could hear the voice, but not the words. Ida said she said it was like hearing her mother through a wall. She knew the voice. She could not hear what it was saying. They sat with this, he said. 2 instances, 25 years apart, both in hard winters, both the same description, voices in the snow, words just below understanding. She said, "And now," he said, "and now." She said, "What do you think it is?" He looked at the fire. He said, "I've thought about it on and off for 25 years. Every time something reminded me of it. A certain quality of cold, a certain kind of overcast sky. I've thought about what kind of thing would produce a voice that had the shape of language, but not the content. That sounded like someone you knew but said nothing you could hear." He said, "The closest I've come is this. I think the land in this particular place, in this particular kind of winter, does something with the voices of people who have been here. I don't know how. I don't know why. But I think the cold, or something the cold enables, brings back something of what was said here before. Not clearly. Not completely. Like an echo that has traveled too far to be distinct. The shape of the sound without the sound itself." Ida said, "You think we're hearing the past?" He said, "I think we might be. I think we might be hearing the voices of everyone who has ever spoken in this place, or some of them, carried back to us by something the winter does." He paused. "I know how that sounds," she said. "It sounds like what it sounds like." She picked up her cup. "We've been here 31 years. If anyone is going to hear the voices of the people who were here before us, it would be us," he said. "Yes, that's what I think," she said. "Who was here before us? Before the settlement?" He looked at the window. He said, "The Osage. For a long time before us, and before them. Someone else, probably. This ground has been spoken over for a long time." She said, "And now we're hearing it." He said, "And now we're hearing it." They sat by the fire and listened to the sound of the house in the winter, the creak of cold wood, the hiss of the fire, the ordinary sounds of an old structure in a hard season. Outside, if you listened carefully, or perhaps only at the threshold of listening, there was the other thing, the voices, just below. In the days that followed, Elias paid closer attention to the voices, than he had paid to anything in some time. He was not a man who approached things carelessly, but there was a quality of deliberate attention he brought to this that was different from his ordinary attentiveness. The attention of a man who has been given, late in life, the chance to examine something he has been thinking about for 25 years. He went outside each morning before the light was fully up, in the coldest part of the day, and stood in the yard and listened. He went out in the afternoons. He went out after supper, when the sky was dark and the cold had the particular density that darkness added to it. He developed, over those first days, a sense of the voices as having qualities beyond their basic presence. They were not consistent in their character from hour to hour or day to day. In the coldest hours before the light, they were most present, not louder, but denser, more numerous, the sense of multiple voices stronger. In the middle of the day, when the temperature moderated slightly even in hard winter, they receded to a point where he sometimes had to be very still and very deliberate to find them, to confirm they were still there. At dusk they returned, and the particular quality of dusk, the dimming of light without the full establishment of dark, the transitional hour that had always felt to him like the hour of the threshold, made them feel more present than any other time of day. He brought this to Ida each evening. She had her own observations made from inside the house, from the kitchen window and the bedroom window, and occasionally from the doorway when she stood in the cold for a minute and listened before going back in. Her observations and his corroborated each other without being identical, which he found encouraging. It suggested they were both perceiving the same thing independently, not constructing it from each other's suggestion. She said, on the fourth evening, "They're not all the same age." He looked at her. She said, "Some of them sound, I don't know how to put this precisely. Some of them sound further away than others, not in distance, in time. The further ones have a quality of being very old, the nearer ones less so." He thought about this. He said, like a conversation happening at multiple distances simultaneously, each distance being a different era. She said, "Yes, that's it exactly." He thought about the settlement's 31 years, about the Osage before that, about whatever had come before the Osage, all of it layered, in the air of the place, each layer at a different depth, audible now because the cold was sufficient to bring all the layers close to the surface simultaneously. He said, "We're the nearest layer," she said. "Yes, we're the freshest." He said, "And someday someone will hear us this way, below the threshold, not knowing what we said, only that we were here." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Does that comfort you?" He said, "More than I would have expected." By the end of the first week, 7 households in the Sallow Creek settlement had reported hearing the voices. This was known not through any organized communication, but through the ordinary social circulation of a small community in winter. One family mentioning it to another in passing, the other family acknowledging that yes, they had heard it too. The acknowledgement spreading outward until it had made the full circuit of the settlement and become a shared fact. The Varnas knew about it because their daughter Ruth came on Thursday, earlier than her usual Sunday, with the specific quality of urgency that she wore when she had something important to say. She said, "Have you heard it?" Ida said, "Sit down." Yes. Ruth sat. She was 43 years old, and she had her mother's capacity for careful attention and her father's steadiness, and she sat at the kitchen table that had held so many serious conversations, and she said, "The children heard it. That's what concerns me." Nate and the girl both came to me on Tuesday evening and said there were voices outside. I told them it was the wind. Ida said, and they accepted that. Ruth said. Nate did. The girl, she paused. The girl said it wasn't the wind. She said the wind sounded like itself, and this sounded like people talking. Elias said, she's right. Ruth looked at her father. He said, it does sound like people talking. That's exactly what it sounds like. Ruth said, what is it? He told her what he had told Ida. The winter of 51, the Calder boy. The winter of 63, Paulette Greer and her mother's voice. His theory about the cold and the land and the voices of the people who had come before. He told it the same way he had told everything serious in his life. Plainly, without embellishment, with explicit acknowledgement of what he knew and what he was guessing. Ruth listened with the full quality of attention she had inherited from both parents simultaneously, which was rare and which Elias had always been privately proud of. She made no expression while he spoke. She asked no questions. She received the account the way she had been taught, implicitly, to receive things that required more than one sitting to fully process. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. She said, you think we're hearing dead people? He said, I think we might be hearing what was said here by people who are gone. That's not quite the same as hearing dead people. Ruth said, it sounds like the same thing. He said, maybe it is. I don't know the mechanism. I only know the pattern. Ruth said, what do we do? This was Ruth's question in every situation. Not what does it mean, not what should we feel about it, but what do we do? Elias had always found this clarifying. It pushed past interpretation directly into the practical, which was often where the real answer lived. He said, I don't think there's anything to do. In 51, it lasted about 10 days. In 63, I believe it was similar, though I can only verify Paulette's account, and she didn't give me a duration. It ends when the weather breaks. Ruth said, so we wait. He said, we go about our lives and we wait. Yes. Ruth said, do I tell the children what it is? Ida said, what would you tell them? Ruth thought about this. She said, I'd tell them that the land has a long memory, and sometimes in hard winters it speaks. I'd tell them there's nothing to be afraid of, and that, if they stand still and listen, they might hear something very old. Elias looked at his daughter. He said, yes, tell them that. On the 6th day, the settlement's school teacher came to the Varna house. She was a young woman named Bess Hale, who had come to Sallow Creek the previous autumn, from a town in the eastern part of the state, assigned to the settlement's recently established school by a county board that sent teachers to rural communities on a rotating basis. She was 24 years old and had the specific quality of a person who had been educated beyond the immediate practical needs of her circumstances, and who was still, at 24, working out what to do with the surplus. She was intelligent and observant, and somewhat at loose ends in the settlement, which was smaller and more isolated than she had expected, and she had developed the habit of coming to the Varn household because Elias and Ida were the kind of people who could sustain a conversation of the sort she had not found much of in her first months in the valley. She came on the 6th day with the quality of urgency that Elias had come to recognize as her primary social register, the urgency of a person for whom every interesting thing was equally interesting, which was a young person's condition that he remembered from a great distance. She said, before she had fully come through the door, have you heard it? The voices? Ida said, sit down and have coffee. She sat. She said, I've been hearing it since Tuesday. I thought at first it was the neighbors. The Petrie property is close to the school, and sometimes when I'm at the school in the evening, I can hear them if they're outside. But the Petries are in the other direction, and when I went to the window, the yard was empty. She paused. "I've been trying to record what I hear." Elias looked at her. She said, "I've been writing down descriptions of it. The quality, the apparent direction, the time of day, whether it's louder or softer. I thought perhaps a systematic record might reveal something." He said, "What has it revealed?" She opened her coat and produced a small notebook and set it on the table and opened it. The pages were dense with careful handwriting, the record of 6 days of precise observation. She read from it. No apparent single source of origin. Seems to come from the air uniformly, rather than from a specific direction. Loudest in the coldest hours, early morning and evening. Seems to be multiple voices speaking simultaneously, with the character of conversation, rather than monologue, the back-and-forth quality of exchange. Impossible to make out specific words. Register suggests adult voices, both male and female. No children's voices distinguishable. She looked up. She said, "That last point interested me. If it's, whatever it is, if it's the voices of people who lived here before. Why no children? Children speak as much as adults." Elias sat with this. He said, "Perhaps children's voices have a different quality, carry differently. Or perhaps they're there and the register is too high to distinguish at this distance." She said, "Or perhaps whatever holds the voices here selects for a certain kind of speech, adult speech, speech that had deliberate meaning behind it." She paused. "Children speak a great deal, but a large portion of it is not deeply meant in the way that adult speech is meant. Perhaps the land holds the speech that was meant most deeply." Elias looked at her for a moment. He said, "That's a better theory than mine." She said, "What's yours?" he told her. She listened with the quality of attention that made her good at her work, which was genuine and unhurried and made no preliminary judgments. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The same explanation from different angles. You're saying the land holds speech. I'm saying it might select which speech it holds. Both could be true." He said, "Both could be true." She said, "How many occurrences have there been before this winter?" He told her about the Calder boy and Paulette Greer. She wrote this in her notebook with the same careful hand. She said, "I'd like to speak with them. With the Calder boy. He's grown now, isn't he? And with Mrs. Greer if she's still living." He said, "Henry Calder is on the east side. Paulette Greer died in 72. She wrote this down. She said, a pattern of occurrence in hard winters, consistent description across 30 years. This is the kind of thing that should be documented more carefully than it has been." Elias said, "I've been documenting it in my way." She said, "In your head." He said, "Yes." She said, "That dies with you." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Yes, that's true." She said, "I'd like to write it down properly, with your account and Henry Calder's and whatever else I can find. Would you be willing to tell me everything you know?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Good." She opened to a fresh page in the notebook. On the 9th night, Elias went outside. He had not planned to. He had been lying awake in the way he sometimes lay awake in hard winters, not from worry, but from the particular restless alertness of a man whose body was older than his habits, who had spent 67 years rising before dawn, and whose body still presented itself for waking in the small hours regardless of need. He lay in the dark and listened to Ida's breathing beside him, and to the sounds of the house, and under the sounds of the house, as he had been hearing it for 9 days now, the voices. They were clearer tonight. Not clear. The words were still below the threshold of comprehension, still on the other side of the door he had described to Ida, but closer to the threshold, as though whatever produced them had moved toward him in the night, had shortened the distance, had decided to speak from closer range. He got up without waking Ida and put on his coat and boots and went outside. The cold hit him with the specific authority of a deep December night, not the hostile cold of wind and exposure, but the settled, absolute cold of a clear, windless night below zero, the kind of cold that was beyond argument. The sky was open and the stars were out in the winter abundance, excessive, as winter stars always were, the sky offering more than any human visual system could take in. His breath came out in clouds that drifted straight up in the stillness. He stood in the yard. The voices were all around him. Not louder outside than inside. If anything, the distinction between the voices and the night was cleaner inside. The contrast between the human interior and the inhuman exterior, making the voices easier to locate and attend to. Outside, the voices were simply part of the night's texture, another quality of the air alongside the cold and the starlight and the specific silence that very cold, very clear nights produced. They were present the way the cold was present, everywhere, sourceless, constitutive of the experience rather than distinct from it. He stood and listened with the full, careful attention he had developed over 67 years of listening to things that mattered. He could not make out the words. He had not expected to. But he could, he found, when he stopped trying to hear specific language and simply attended to the quality of the sound, begin to hear something more than he had heard from inside the house. Not words, but structure. The structure of speech, the rhythm of it, the alternation of voices that was conversation, the way one voice moved and another responded, and the first moved again. The music of human exchange, stripped of its content, preserved in whatever medium the cold land used to preserve such things. He stood and listened to the structure of old conversations. He thought about who had spoken here. The settlement had been in this place for 31 years, which meant 31 winters, which meant 31 accumulations of speech. Every conversation held outdoors in every cold season, every call across a yard, every exchange between neighbors on the road. And before that, the Osage, who had used this valley for how long he did not know but suspected was very long. Long enough to have left the land shaped by their presence in ways that European settlement had not fully overwritten. All of that speech, all of those voices, preserved in whatever the cold did to the land that enabled this particular strangeness. And now, in this particular winter, in this specific conjunction of temperature and stillness and whatever else made the preservation audible, rising back to the surface. He thought about what it meant that the voices were below understanding. He had been thinking about this for 9 days, and he had arrived at something that felt true without being provable, which was the best he ever managed with questions of this kind. He thought, the words are gone, only the shape of the words remains. Whatever the cold preserves, it cannot preserve the specific content, the specific meaning of a specific utterance, made by a specific person on a specific day. That is too individual, too contingent, too dependent on the moment of its making to survive the kind of storage that the land provided. What survived was the pattern, the rhythm, the fact of speech, the evidence that people had been here and had spoken and had meant things to each other, preserved without the meaning itself, the container without the contents. He thought, perhaps this is always how the past comes back, in the shape of things rather than the things themselves, in the pattern rather than the substance. We hear the rhythm of old voices, and we cannot quite make out what they said, and this is not a failure of the transmission. It is the nature of transmission across that distance. The meaning was for the moment of its making. Only the evidence of meaning survives. He stood in the cold yard under the excessive winter stars and held this thought and found it was not comforting exactly, but it was true, or was the closest he could get to true, which at 67 he had long since learned was generally sufficient. He went back inside. Ida was awake when he came to bed, lying still in the way she lay still when she was awake and waiting. He said, "I went outside to listen." She said, "I know. How was it?" He said, "It was the same. Better, somehow." Outside it was just the night. She said, "Did you hear anything you recognized?" He thought about this. He said, "I heard the structure of it, the back and forth, the sound of people meaning things to each other." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't need to know what they were saying. The fact that they were saying it was enough." She took his hand under the quilts. They lay in the dark and listened to the voices below the threshold of the words. After a while, she said, "Do you think they can hear us?" He said, "I've been wondering that," she said. "And," he said, "I think probably not. I think it's only in one direction. We can hear toward the past, but the past can't hear toward us. The cold does something with what has been said here, but it doesn't operate in both directions." She said, "You sound certain." He said, "I'm not certain. It's what I think." She said, "What if you're wrong? What if they can hear us?" He lay in the dark and thought about this. He said, "Then I hope they hear something worth hearing." She was quiet for a moment. She said, 31 years of living here. I think they would." He said, "Yes, I think they would." On the 12th day, the Calder boy came. He was not a boy anymore. Henry Calder was 35 years old, a farmer on the east side of the settlement, a solid and reliable man with 3 children, and a wife who had come from outside the county. He was not one of the 7 households that had reported hearing the voices in the first week, which Elias had noted without knowing what to make of it. Perhaps the voices were not audible everywhere in the settlement, or not with the same clarity. Perhaps some households were more attuned to them than others, for reasons of geography or construction, or something he could not identify. He came to the Varn property on a Tuesday afternoon, and Ida brought him in and gave him coffee, and he sat at the kitchen table and turned the cup in his hands for a moment before he spoke. He said, "I heard it's been happening again." Elias said, "Yes, about 2 weeks now." Henry said, "I haven't heard it this time, not directly. But my oldest, he's 9, came to me last week and said there were voices outside when he was in the yard at dusk. He said he'd been trying to hear what they were saying and he couldn't quite make it out." Elias looked at him. Henry said, "I told him about when I was 10, about the night I followed the voices to the Petrie barn. I hadn't told him before. I hadn't talked about it in years, honestly. I told him, the voices are real. They're old. They won't hurt you. They're just the land remembering." He said, "Is that right? Is that how you understand it?" Elias said, "It's close to how I understand it." Henry said, "I wanted to come and ask you, because you've been here longer than anyone. If anyone knows what it is, it's you." Elias said, "I've been thinking about it for 25 years. I have a theory. It's not certainty." Henry said, "I'll take a theory." Elias told him. The same account he had given Ida, or the same account he had given Ruth. He told it with the consistency of a man who had found the most accurate language he could find and was not going to improve on it by variation. Henry listened. He was quiet afterward for a moment. He said, "The land remembering. That's essentially what you're saying," Elias said. "Yes. In whatever way land remembers, which I don't understand and don't claim to, this land remembers voices. In deep cold, in winters like this one." Henry said, "Why voices? Why not other things?" Elias said, "I've asked myself that. The best I have is that voice is what people leave most in a place. When you live somewhere, you speak in it constantly. Every day, for years. All of that speech goes into the air of the place. Maybe most places it just dissipates, goes away. But some places, for whatever reason, hold it. This place seems to be one of those." Henry said, "Do the voices get closer? Over time?" Elias looked at him. He said, "What do you mean?" Henry said, "I mean, in 51, you said they were there for 10 days and then they stopped. In 63, similar. Has each occurrence been more or stronger or different in character?" Elias sat with this question. He had not asked it directly. He had been so focused on the pattern of the thing, the recurrence, the consistency of description across instances, the confirmation of his theory, that he had not considered whether the thing was developing, whether it was the same thing returning or a thing that returned each time with a different character. He said, "In 51, I wasn't paying careful attention. I only learned about the Calder boy later. In 63, I noticed it, but didn't go outside. I only heard it from indoors. This time I've been listening carefully since the beginning." He said, "I went outside on the 9th night, and I could hear more than I've heard before. Not words, but the structure of speech, the back and forth of it, paused. More than I think I would have heard 9 days in the earlier occurrences. If I had gone outside then," Henry said, "so it is getting stronger." "Each time." Elias said, "I don't know if stronger is the right word. Closer to audible. Each winter it happens. It seems to come a little closer to the surface." They sat with this. Henry said, "What happens when it breaks the surface, when it gets close enough that you can hear the words?" Elias had no answer for this. He had not asked the question before, because he had not followed the logic far enough to reach it. He sat with it now, and found that the reaching of it produced something in him that was not fear precisely, but was in the same range, a quality of awareness, and attentiveness to the stakes of what he had been thinking about. He said, "I don't know." Henry said, "Do you think it will? This winter or the next? Or some winter? Will it get close enough that someone hears the words?" Elias said, "I think it might." Henry said, "And you don't know what that would mean?" Elias said, "No. I don't know what it would mean to hear a voice from the past clearly enough to understand it. I don't know if the person would know what they were hearing. I don't know if understanding would be different from almost understanding." He said, "I've been almost understanding for 25 years. In some ways, that might be better. Once you understand a thing fully, you can't go back to not understanding it. The almost understanding leaves the thing partly open." Henry looked at him. He said, "That sounds like something you believe." Elias said, "It's something I've arrived at. Whether I believe it is another matter." Henry nodded. He finished his coffee and set the cup down and stood up. He said, "The land remembering. That's what I'll tell my boy. That's what I'll tell him it is." Elias said, "It's as close as I've gotten." Henry said, "It's enough." He went out into the cold. Elias sat at the table for a while after he left, listening. The voices were there, as they had been for 12 days below the level of words. carrying the structure of everything that had been said in this place across all its winters. He sat and listened to them, and felt, in the listening, the specific weight of 31 years of living in one place, the way a place accumulated you as you accumulated it, the way you became, over decades, part of what the place held, part of what it would eventually offer back, in some form, to some future listener. He thought about Ida's question, in the dark. Do you think they can hear us? He thought. In 50 years, or 100, or 200, in some hard winter not yet arrived, someone will stand in this yard, or in a yard somewhere near this yard, and they will hear the voices in the snow. And among those voices, below the threshold of words, they will hear something that has the shape of the life he and Ida had made here. The conversations held in this kitchen, the calls across the yard in summer, the 31 years of ordinary speech in an ordinary life, in a particular place that had the quality of holding what was said in it. They would not be able to make out the words. They would hear only the shape of the meaning, the evidence that people had been here and had spoken and had mattered to each other. He thought, that is enough. That is, perhaps, everything that can be asked for. That the evidence of your presence should remain. That the fact of your having spoken should be audible, even if the words are gone. Even if what remains is only the music of a life, stripped of its specific content, preserved in the cold that holds such things. He sat at the kitchen table and listened to the old voices, until Ida came in and told him supper was ready. He said, "Coming." He said it in the ordinary way, as he said everything in the ordinary way, and the sound of it went into the air of the kitchen and became part of what the room held, added to everything that had been said here before, accumulating in the way that things accumulated in a place where the land had the quality of memory. He stood up and went to his wife, and the sound of his chair on the kitchen floor and his footsteps across the room and her voice saying supper's ready went into the air of the house and became part of what the room held, added to everything that had been said here before, accumulating in the ordinary way of a life lived in a place that had the quality of memory. He went to his wife. Bess Hale compiled her account of the winter of 1876 over the following spring and submitted it, with some hesitation, to a journal of natural history published in St. Louis that occasionally included accounts of unusual local phenomena. The journal declined to publish it. The editor wrote back that the account was interesting as a record of local belief, but did not meet the standard of evidence required for publication as a natural history document. She kept the account. She left Sallow Creek the following autumn and returned to the east, as teachers on rotation eventually did, and she took her notebook and her compiled record with her. She taught in 3 more schools over the following decade, married, had children, grew old. The notebook stayed with her papers. Her grandson found it after her death in 1931 and read it with the interest of a young man finding an unexpected window into a grandmother's past. He did not know what to make of the voices, but he recognized the quality of the record, the care of it, the consistency of the method, the refusal to embellish. He kept the notebook and eventually, in the 1940s, donated it along with other family papers to a university archive in Missouri, where it was cataloged as a document related to Ozark folklore and winter traditions. A researcher who examined it in the 1970s noted it in a paper on acoustic anomalies attributed to weather conditions in enclosed valleys, proposing that what the Sallow Creek residents had heard was a form of acoustic reflection produced by temperature inversions in valley geography. The paper was published in a regional scientific journal and cited twice before disappearing into the archive of papers that describe phenomena without quite capturing them. Elias Varn's version of the account, the one he gave Bess Hale over several conversations in December of 1876, recorded in her notebook, reads as follows in its essential portion. I have come to believe that voices accumulate in a place the way anything accumulates in a place, gradually, across time, as the residue of use. A place that has been spoken in for long enough holds something of the speech, not the specific content, not the words themselves, which are gone, but the fact of the speech, the evidence of meaning. The land does not have the capacity to store language, but it has the capacity to store the evidence that language happened, the shape of it, the pattern of it, the specific character of human exchange. And in hard winters, in places like this valley, where the cold settles and concentrates and reaches a depth it does not reach in more open country, this residue comes close to the surface. Close enough to hear, not quite close enough to understand. He said, "This is what I believe. I may be entirely wrong, but I have been listening to this place for 31 years, and this is the most honest account I have of what it does." The voices in the Sallow Creek settlement ceased on the 14th day of December, 1876. This was established with reasonable precision because Elias Varn noted it in the daily record he kept. Not a journal in the personal sense, but a practical log, the kind that farmers maintained for agricultural purposes, noting weather and labor and conditions. He had been making brief notes about the voices since they began, and the note for December 14th read, "Cold broke slightly overnight. South wind this morning. The voices have stopped." He made no further notation about them. There was nothing further to note that could be captured in the practical language of a farm record. What he thought, what he had arrived at in the 14 days of listening and the 25 years before that, was not the kind of thing that went into a farm log. His daughter Ruth had been keeping her own record, in a different form, a letter to a friend in Tennessee, written over the course of the 2 weeks, that described what was happening and what her father believed about it and what she herself thought. This letter survived. The friend had kept it, and the friend's daughter had kept it, and it had eventually found its way into a family archive that was donated to a historical society in the early part of the 20th century, where a cataloger had noted it as an interesting document related to Ozark winter folklore and placed it in a folder with similar materials. Ruth's letter was careful and intelligent and reflected both her father's patience with the unknown and her own more practical disposition. She wrote, near its end, "Father says the voices are the land's memory, that this particular piece of ground holds what is spoken on it in cold winters and gives it back. He has believed this for 25 years, and this winter has only confirmed him in it. I am inclined to believe it too, not because I can verify it, but because I have heard the voices myself, and I have no better account of them, and Father's account fits what I have heard in a way that nothing else does. What I find myself thinking about, though, is the incompleteness of it. The voices speak words we cannot hear. The meaning is gone. Only the shape remains. Father finds this acceptable. He says the shape is enough. The evidence of speech is enough. We don't need to understand the specific content to know that people were here and meant things. I think he is right. I also think there is something in the incompleteness that the land is being honest about. The past does not speak to us clearly. It speaks to us in the way we can receive it, which is shape without content, rhythm without meaning, the music of old lives without the words that made the music. This is not a failure of transmission. It is the true nature of what we can know across time. The specific moments are gone. What remains is only the evidence that they happened. She wrote, "I heard my grandmother last night. I do not know that it was her. I have no way to verify it, and Father would be careful to say so. But there was a voice among the voices that had a quality I recognized. The way you recognize a piece of music you have not heard since childhood. Not the notes exactly, but the character of the thing, the particular way it moved through the air. If it was her, she was not saying anything I could make out. She was simply speaking. She was present, at the edge of hearing, in the place where she had spoken 30 years ago. She wrote, I think this is what the land offers. Not the content, not the words, only the presence. The unignorable fact that someone was here and spoke and meant something and left the evidence of the meaning behind. That is the gift of a place that remembers. That is what Father has been receiving in pieces for 25 years. That is what I received last night. I could not hear what she said, but I knew she had been here. That was enough. There was one more thing that happened in the 14th winter that Elias did not speak of widely. On the 13th day, the day before the weather broke and the voices ceased, Ida heard words. Not clearly, not fully, but closer than they had ever come, close enough that afterward she could not say with certainty whether she had truly heard them or had only heard close, enough that her mind had constructed the content from the shape. This was the ambiguity she sat with, and the ambiguity was not resolvable, and she understood that the unresolvability was itself information of a kind. She had been standing at the window in the late afternoon, the light already failing, the cold pressing against the glass. The voices had been present, as they always were in the cold hours, and she had been listening with the resigned patience of someone who has spent 2 weeks listening to something that will not reveal itself. And then, for a moment, brief enough that it might have been a second, long enough that she had time to notice it, the voices came close. Not all of them. One. A single voice, rising briefly above the general texture of the sound, distinct enough from the background that it had individuality, a particular register, a particular rhythm, a particular quality that she associated, in the part of her mind where recognition lived, with someone she had known. She could not have said with certainty who. She could not have quoted a word. But there was a moment when the voice was close enough and distinct enough that she had a sense, powerful if unverifiable, of meaning. Not the content of meaning, not what was said, the quality of meaning, the specific character of something being said with love, or with care, or with the particular tenderness of someone saying something they wanted to be heard and believed. She stood at the window and received this and held it and said nothing for a long time. When Elias came in, she was at the stove, and she told him over supper what had happened, in the same careful way they told each other everything, plainly, with acknowledgement of what was certain and what was not. He listened. He said, "Do you know who it was?" She said, "I think so. I'm not certain." He said, "Does it matter? Whether you're certain?" She thought about this. She said, "No, I don't think it does. What I received is what I received. Whether my mind supplied the attribution or the voice supplied it, the experience was the same. Someone who loved me was speaking from inside all those old voices, and for one moment it was close enough to hear the love in it, even without the words. He said, "That's enough," she said. "Yes, that's exactly enough." She went back to tending the stove. He sat at the table and looked at his hands and thought about the word enough, about how a man in 67 years of living arrived at knowing what enough was, and about how it turned out when you arrived at it. to be less than you had sometimes wanted, and more than you had sometimes feared, and exactly as much as was true. The following winter was mild, and the voices did not return, nor the winter after that. There were 3 mild winters in a row in Sallow Creek, 1877 through 1879, and in those 3 winters the settlement went about its ordinary life, in the ordinary quiet of a place that had a peculiarity it had learned to live with. People did not speak of the voices much in those mild years, not from forgetting, but from the particular quality of knowledge that does not require constant articulation. It was known. It was part of what the place was. In hard winters, in certain conditions of cold and stillness, the land in the Sallow Creek settlement spoke in the voices of those who had spoken in it before. They had a word for it by then, as communities develop words for the specific things that belong to them. Ruth's daughter had started calling it the old talking, which was inexact, but was the kind of name that stuck. Plain, descriptive, carrying the right amount of the thing without trying to explain more than it could. The old talking. When the winter is hard enough and still enough, and the cold has been settled for long enough, the old talking begins. Elias Varn died in the winter of 1882, in the same house he had built in 1846, in the bedroom where he and Ida had slept for 36 years. He died in January, in a hard winter, in the particular cold that enabled what he had spent his life thinking about. Ida was beside him. His daughter Ruth was in the house. The voices were outside. Ruth would write about this later, in a letter, that in the last hours of her father's life, the old talking had been louder than she had ever heard it. Not loud as in volume, but close, as her father had described the progression of it over the decades. Close to the surface, almost words. She had stood at the window in the small hours and listened, and had felt, for the first time, that she was nearly on the verge of understanding, that whatever the threshold was between shape and meaning, between pattern and content, she was very close to it. She had not crossed it. The words had stayed below comprehension, as they always had. She wrote, but I stood at the window, and I heard the shape of something very large, very old, the accumulated speech of everyone who had ever lived and spoken in this place, going back further than the settlement, further than any record, back to the first time a human voice had said anything in this particular fold of the Ozark land. All of it, present simultaneously, layered like the strata of the limestone under the soil. All of those voices, together, below the threshold of my understanding. She wrote, Father always said the almost understanding was better, that it left the thing open, that full understanding would close it. I believed him when he said it. Standing at the window on the morning of his death, listening to voices I could not quite hear, I understood why he believed it. She wrote, if the words are just below understanding, then the meaning is still possible. It has not been foreclosed. There is still something to reach toward. The moment you hear clearly is the moment you have all of it. And having all of it means the reaching is over, and the reaching is where the life is. She wrote, so I stood at the window and almost heard, and that was right. That was the right amount to hear. She put down her pen and went back to her mother and sat with her through the rest of the night. Outside, in the cold and the dark, in the snow that lay across the fields and the yard and the road, in the still and absolute quiet of a January night when the temperature had dropped below anything that could be called ordinary, the old talking continued. It would continue for 6 more days before the weather broke. And in those 6 days, as it always was in the Sallow Creek settlement in the winters when it came, it was present and constant and below the level of words, the shape of meaning without the meaning, the evidence of lives without the lives themselves, the unignorable fact of all the voices that had spoken in that place, pressing up through the cold toward the ears of those who were still listening. Patient, persistent, almost, always almost, understood. Elias Varn's own voice is in there now, among all the others. His voice and Ida's voice and Ruth's voice and the voices of the 31 families who made their lives in the Sallow Creek Valley across the years, added to the Osage voices before them, added to whatever came before the Osage, all of it layered, all of it waiting. In the cold winters, when the temperature drops far enough and the stillness settles deep enough and the conditions are right, someone standing in what remains of that valley will hear the old talking begin. They will step outside in the gray morning and hear something at the edge of perception. Voices, several of them, the unmistakable texture of human speech, saying something they almost understand. They will stand in the cold and listen, as Elias listened, as Ida listened, as everyone who has lived in a place long enough to know it eventually listens, for the evidence of all who came before, pressing up through the cold, offering what the past can offer, which is not the content but the presence, not the words but the fact of the words, not the meaning but the shape where the meaning was, almost heard, almost understood, which is, in the end, perhaps as close as any of us was meant to get. Close enough to know the voices are there, close enough to know we are not the first, close enough to understand, without understanding the words, that everyone who came before us was here and spoke and meant something and left the evidence of the meaning behind in the cold and the dark and the long patient waiting of a place that does not forget, and which is, as Elias Varn said on a January morning in 1877, lying in the dark beside his wife with the old voices below the threshold of the words, "Enough. The land remembers. In hard winters, it speaks. And if you stand in the cold and listen with the kind of attention that asks nothing of what it hears, only to receive it, you will hear, just below the reach of comprehension, the voices of everyone who was here before you, saying something that was true, something that mattered, something that the cold has kept for you, all this time, just below the surface of the silence, waiting for a winter hard enough to bring it close, waiting for ears willing to stand in the dark and almost hear,